people in the world's first modern democracy, does the Constitution give equal chances to live in dignity? What happens when people invest into the prison system? An example, lobbyism in the United States. Santa Rosa County, nearby the Gulf of Mexico, known for agriculture, found that the population has doubled between 1980 and 2000. The prison industry leads the way for settlement to rural areas and mass incarceration. Prison industrial complex, a business that attracts many that make profit on the construction of correctional detention and community re-entry services. The GEO Group, a for-profit prison contracted by a government. As Brian Stevenson, the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative and a professor at the New York University Law School, defines in his book, Just Mercy, millions of dollars were spent lobbying state legislators to keep expanding the use of incarcerations to respond to just about any problem. Incarceration is the response to healthcare problems like drug addiction or mental disabilities. Sending people into prison is even justified when poverty or unemployment forces somebody to write a bad check, or if background circumstances lead the way for child behavioral disorders. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistic, 56% of inmates were kept in state prison, 45% in federal prison, and 64% in private prison. Under certain circumstances, the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, together with for-profit prisons, can lock up a whole family instead of sending them back. But who has been as powerful as to create new crime categories and to provide fear and anger that keeps mass incarcerations alive during the last 25 years in the United States of America? Just as the GEO Group is seeking to profit by incarceration migrant parents and children currently fleeing to the United States from Central America, the same company has already made billions of dollars incarcerating migrant border crossers over the last 15 years. GEO's dreadful record of poor performance and appalling conditions in the prison and detention facilities it operates under contract with the federal government, which includes deaths in custody, overcrowding, lack of medical care, and extreme isolation. Since 2003, the CCA and the GEO Group have combined to spend more than $32 million lobbying the federal government, including direct lobbying of Department of Homeland Security, the agency responsible to contracts to detain immigrant families. GEO Group and CCA have employed an impressive mix of influential Republican and Democratic lobbyists, including former high-ranking DHS officials. Juveniles sentenced to life imprisonment under the 8th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The majority of youth sentenced to life without parole are contracted in just 5 states: California, Florida, Louisiana, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The majority of sentences to life without parole for youth have been imposed in states where judges are obligated to impose it as a mandatory sentence without consideration of any factors relating to a child's age or life circumstances. Most of them are inmates in adult prison, what usually enforces the development of mental disabilities. Today, more than 3,000 juveniles are in jail as lifers without parole. Nevertheless, changes in law and proceeding under the 8th Amendment cleared the way for fighting for children's rights and saving poor lives since the 1980s. The case Roper v. Simmons in 2005 saved actively the lives of 43 juveniles who were awaiting execution. It is way more shocking and horrifying that 365 children had been legally executed, 22 since 1985. The youngest child sentenced to death by the electric chair was innocently charged of the murder of 2 11-year-old girls. George Jr. Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old boy of color, was accused after giving the police hints where he has seen the girls as they asked him where they could pick flowers. He was executed through the state of South Carolina. He was subjected to hours of interrogation without an attorney or his parents. Inside the courtroom, people of color were not allowed. Did segregation end? One example, Alcolu, South Carolina. The importance of this case plays a big role in the small town where the murdered girls have lived, as their little community nearby Alkolu was racially separated through railroad tracks. The girls crossing the railroad walked through the poor African-American part of their town. Both sides and both communities do still exist, and they are still separated by a railroad. With one difference. Back then, the majority of the community was white. There were only about 5% of African Americans living there. Today we have about 50% of people of color in the town top 10 of the concentration of poverty. Let's have a closer look at the situation today. One example, Hurricane Katrina in the year 2005. In retrospect, it is obvious that no force of human rights or civil rights activists succeeding in abolishing segregation. The hurricane hit in fact the former big slave districts, Louisiana, Missouri, and a little part of Alabama. During the hurricane in New Orleans Parish, where 70% of the victims counted in the study died, the mortality rate for black adults increased from 1.7 to 4 times higher compared to the mortality rate for white adults. There was no chance to escape. There was no protection. Nothing could help to protect the citizens. Nearly all homes were made of wood. More than 500,000 people had no access to cars. What does a storm leaves over? By the way, in New Orleans, 125 years after local militia attempted to wrest control of the city from Reconstruction forces after the Civil War, 33 militia were killed. The so-called Liberty Monument was built in their honor to represent the defeat of the local militia in the heart of New Orleans in the French Quarter. It was not removed, not even after the majority had become African American, even as mayors, people of color, attempted to destroy it. In 1990, it was moved outside the French Quarter, next to the waterfront. Now it stands right around the corner and reminds of the white supremacy. It survived Katrina, while everything else in New Orleans was destroyed. Less than a third of the population of New Orleans was white, 27%, and 2/3 were black, when Katrina came. The well-known Garden District illustrates the wealth that wealthy white newcomers had built opulent structures based on the prosperity of New Orleans in the time of the abolishment of slavery. They wanted to move out the French Quarter, after more and more people of color settled in. They were able to build mansions around there, which were able to resist Hurricane Katrina, while mostly 66% of townspeople had to be evacuated. The National Assessment of Educational Progress explains what is wrong with the national school system. Achievement for both black and white students was lower in the highest black density school than in the lowest black density school. However, as finds the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the achievement gap was not different. Everywhere on the net you'll find rankings of the worst cities for school education, made by parents to kind of exchange their thoughts. However, their thoughts are based on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, leaving statistics to evaluate whether a school is a good one or one of the worst. It is a shame that these statistics show that these bad schools are often underpaid, concerning the teacher rewards and also paltry spending per student. Therefore, we can see clearly that it is still a lack of money that leads public schools to be rejected. We can also see that a high grade of education needs a higher payment. Obviously, that is the reason why the average of pupil per teacher ratio is below the national standard. But where is the lack? An achievement gap separating black from white students has long been documented, a social divide extremely vexing to policymakers and the target of one blast of school reform after another. Nevertheless, only 12% of black 4th grade boys are proficient in reading, compared to 38% of white boys. And only 12% of black 8th grade boys are proficient in math, compared with 44% of white boys. The daily headline should be the question whether there is something to improve in our modern democratic world, where peace and freedom for everyone seems to be more than a slogan or a dream.